At 6:14 a.m. on May 14, 1943, Captain Edward Eddie Kowalczyk was told he was going to die. The briefing officer didn't use those words, of course. He talked about acceptable losses and strategic necessity and the importance of disrupting enemy supply lines, but everyone in the room understood what he meant. The target was a railroad bridge at IJmuiden on the Dutch coast. The bridge carried German supplies to the Atlantic Wall fortifications, and destroying it would cripple logistics for the entire sector. Intelligence estimated the bridge was defended by 12 88mm flak guns, 8 37mm automatic cannons, and a Luftwaffe fighter squadron stationed less than 5 miles away. The attack force would be 12 B-26 Marauders flying at 200 feet, low enough to hit the bridge, too low to bail out if they were hit. Expected losses, 50%, 28 years old, 6 months in theater, 0 completed missions. That last statistic wasn't Eddie's fault. The B-26 Marauder had arrived in England with a reputation as a widowmaker, a hot, fast, unforgiving aircraft that had killed more crews in training than the Germans had killed in combat. The first B-26 groups had been decimated by mechanical failures, pilot errors, and a learning curve that was measured in body bags. Eddie had grown up in Chicago, the son of Polish immigrants who'd come to America with nothing but hope and a willingness to work. His father had labored in the stockyards. His mother had taken in laundry. Eddie had worked his way through 2 years of college before the money ran out, then joined the Army Air Corps in 1938 because they promised to teach him to fly. He'd discovered he was good at it. More than good, he was a natural, one of those rare pilots who could feel an aircraft's responses through the controls, who could sense what it needed before the instruments told him. His instructors had recommended him for multi-engine training, and by 1941 he was flying B-18 Bolos for coastal patrol duty. When the B-26 arrived, Eddie had volunteered to learn the new aircraft. Most pilots avoided the Marauder. Its reputation preceded it, and there were safer ways to serve. But Eddie saw something in the sleek, fast bomber that others missed. She wasn't dangerous, he thought. She was just demanding. She required a pilot's full attention, his complete commitment. Give her that, and she'd take you anywhere. He'd been right, but proving it had cost time, and time was something the 322nd didn't have. Eddie's group, the 322nd Bombardment Group, had spent 4 months just learning how to fly the damn things without crashing. They'd lost 6 aircraft in training accidents before they ever saw a German fighter. They'd buried 18 men before they ever dropped a bomb. Now finally, they were ready for combat, and their first mission was a suicide run against one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe. If you're new to WW2 Tales, welcome. This channel covers the incredible true stories of ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances during the Second World War. We upload every week, so subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And stick around to the end of this video, because what Captain Kowalczyk did over the next 3 hours would prove that sometimes the men they send to die refuse to cooperate. The B-26 Marauder was a medium bomber designed for speed. She was smaller than the B-17 Flying Fortress, faster than the B-24 Liberator, and meaner than both of them combined. Her twin Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines produced 4,000 horsepower, pushing her to speeds over 280 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun most fighters in a dive. She carried 4,000 pounds of bombs and 12.50 caliber machine guns, arranged to cover every possible angle of attack. But speed came at a price. The B-26 had the highest wing loading of any American bomber, meaning her wings were small relative to her weight. This made her fast, but it also made her dangerous. She needed a long runway to take off, a high airspeed to stay aloft, and a pilot's full attention every second she was in the air. One moment of inattention, one slight miscalculation, and she'd drop out of the sky like a stone. The crews called her the Flying Prostitute because she had no visible means of support. Her wings looked too small to hold her up. They also called her the Widowmaker, the Baltimore Whore, and a dozen other names that couldn't be printed in newspapers. They loved her and hated her and feared her, sometimes all at the same time. Eddie Kowalczyk had been flying B-26s for 8 months. He'd mastered her quirks, learned her limits, developed the instincts that separated the living pilots from the dead ones. He trusted his aircraft the way a cavalryman trusts his horse, not blindly, but with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what she could and couldn't do. His aircraft was named Ruthless Ruth after his wife back in Chicago. Ruth Kowalczyk had been against the name at first. She didn't like being associated with anything ruthless, but Eddie had convinced her it was a compliment. She's fast, she's beautiful, and she doesn't take any crap from anybody, he'd told her. Just like you. Ruth had 6 crew members, Eddie as pilot, Lieutenant Frank Morrison as co-pilot, Staff Sergeant Anthony Tony Benedetto as bombardier Chaucer navigator, Sergeant William Willie Jackson as top turret gunner, Sergeant James Chen as waist gunner, and Sergeant Robert Bobby Patterson as tail gunner. Morrison was a quiet Texan who'd been an accountant before the war. He was methodical, precise, and utterly unflappable, the perfect complement to Eddie's more instinctive flying style. When things got bad, Morrison kept track of the details: fuel consumption, engine temperatures, navigation calculations. He was the kind of co-pilot who made good pilots great. Tony Benedetto was a street-smart kid from Brooklyn who discovered a talent for mathematics in the Army. He could calculate bombing solutions in his head faster than most men could work a slide rule, and his navigation skills had saved the crew more than once when they'd gotten lost in the English fog. He was also the crew's unofficial morale officer, keeping spirits up with a constant stream of jokes and stories. Willie Jackson was the oldest member of the crew at 34, a former factory worker from Detroit who'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. He manned the top turret, the position that gave him the widest field of fire and the best view of incoming threats. He was calm under pressure, a steady shooter who never wasted ammunition on targets he couldn't hit. James Chen was 22, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who'd faced discrimination throughout his training but had proven himself too valuable to dismiss. His eyesight was exceptional. He could spot enemy fighters before anyone else in the crew, and his gunnery scores were the highest in the squadron. He manned the waist gun on the port side. Bobby Patterson was the youngest at 19, a farm boy from Iowa who'd never been more than 50 miles from home before he enlisted. He was assigned to the tail gun, the loneliest position in the bomber, cut off from the rest of the crew, facing backward into the void. It was a position that required nerves of steel and a willingness to fight alone. Bobby had both. They'd been together since training in Louisiana. They knew each other's voices, habits, fears. They'd played poker together, gotten drunk together, written letters home together. They were more than a crew. They were a family. Now they were about to find out if that family would survive the morning. The 12 B-26s took off from their base at Bury St. Edmunds at 6:45 a.m., forming up into 4 flights of 3 aircraft each. The plan was simple: fly low across the North Sea to avoid radar detection, pop up at the last moment to acquire the target, make a single bombing pass at 200 feet, and run like hell for home. No fighter escort. The RAF Spitfires didn't have the range to cover them over Holland. No diversionary attacks. The 8th Air Force was busy elsewhere. No second chances. If they missed the bridge, they'd have to come back and do it again. The first hint of trouble came 40 minutes into the flight. "Bogies, 11 o'clock low," Willie Jackson called from the top turret. 6 aircraft. Looks like 109s. Eddie's stomach tightened. They were still 20 miles from the Dutch coast, flying at 500 feet to stay below German radar. Fighter interception this far out meant someone had tipped off the Germans, or their radar was better than intelligence had estimated. Either way, they were in trouble. "All aircraft, this is Hammer Lead," the formation commander's voice crackled over the radio. "Maintain formation. Gunners, weapons free. Here they come." The Messerschmitt Bf-109s came in from the port side, diving out of the morning sun in the classic fighter attack. 6 aircraft, painted in the mottled gray of Luftwaffe fighters, their yellow nose cowlings bright against the overcast sky. The 109 was the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, a small, fast, maneuverable aircraft that had dominated the skies over Europe since 1939. Armed with two 7.92mm machine guns and a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, it could tear a bomber apart with a single well-aimed burst, and these pilots knew their business. Eddie watched them come, his hands tight on the controls. At 500 feet, there was nowhere to go. No altitude to trade for speed, no clouds to hide in, no room to maneuver. All he could do was hold formation and let his gunners do their work. "Here they come," he said over the intercom, his voice calm despite the fear that was tightening his chest. "Stay on your guns. Make every shot count." The first 109 opened fire at 800 yards, his 20mm cannon round stitching a line of splashes across the water toward the lead aircraft. The formation's gunners answered with a storm of 50 caliber fire, tracers crisscrossing in a deadly web. The noise was overwhelming. The thunder of the engines, the hammering of the guns, the crack of enemy rounds passing close by. Eddie felt Ruth shudder as Willie opened up from the top turret, the twin .50s sending 800 rounds per minute toward the attacking fighters. Eddie saw the lead 109 stagger as multiple rounds hit home, smoke trailing from his engine. The German pilot pulled up, breaking off the attack, but the other 5 kept coming. "They're splitting up," James called from the waist position. "Two going high, two going low." "Stay on them," Eddie ordered. "Don't let them set up." "Bandit on our tail," Bobby Patterson shouted from the tail position. "He's lining up." Eddie couldn't see behind him, couldn't do anything but trust his tail gunner. He heard Bobby's twin .50s open up, felt Ruth shudder as the Germans' cannon rounds passed just overhead. "Got him! Got him!" Bobby's voice was high with excitement. "He's burning! He's going down!" The first attack was over. 2 German fighters down, 1 American bomber smoking from a hit in the wing. 10 minutes into the mission, and they'd already lost 10% of the enemy's interceptors. But Eddie knew this was just the beginning. The second attack came 15 minutes later as the formation crossed the Dutch coast. This time it was 8 fighters, 4 109s and 4 Focke-Wulf 190s, the Luftwaffe's newest and deadliest interceptors. The 190s were faster than the 109s, more heavily armed, and flown by pilots who knew exactly how to kill bombers. "Hey, here they come again," Morrison said quietly from the co-pilot's seat. "God, there's a lot of them." The Germans had learned from the first attack. Instead of coming in from one direction, they split into 2 groups, 4 fighters from the port side, 4 from starboard. The formation's gunners would have to divide their fire, weakening their defensive concentration. Eddie watched the fighters close, counting the seconds. At this altitude, the attack would be over in moments. Either the Germans would score hits, or they'd have to pull up to avoid crashing into the sea. "Hold steady," he murmured, more to himself than to his crew. "Hold steady." The fighters opened fire at 600 yards. Cannon rounds and machine gun bullets filled the air around Ruth, some of them striking home with metallic clangs that Eddie felt through the controls. The aircraft shook, vibrated, seemed to stagger. And then the Germans were past, pulling up and away, their attack run complete. "Damage report," Eddie called out. "Hydraulics are hit," Morrison reported, scanning the gauges. "Pressure dropping. We're losing fluid." "How bad?" "Bad enough. We won't have brakes when we land. Maybe no flaps either." Eddie processed the information with the cold calculation that combat demanded. No brakes meant a longer landing roll, possibly a crash at the end of the runway. No flaps meant a faster approach speed, less margin for error. Survivable problems if they made it home. Anything else? "Number 2 engine is running rough. Might have taken a hit in the cowling." Eddie glanced at the engine instruments. Number 2 was showing slightly low oil pressure, but nothing critical. "Not yet." "We press on," he said. "Next attack, they won't be so gentle." He was right. The third attack came as they approached the target. The flak started first, the 88mm guns opening up as the formation reached the outskirts of Ijmuiden. At 200 feet, the heavy flak couldn't track them fast enough to score hits, but the 37mm automatic cannons were another matter. Streams of orange tracers rose from the ground, reaching for the bombers like deadly fingers. Eddie saw the aircraft ahead of him take a direct hit from a 37mm shell. The B-26 staggered, rolled to port, and plowed into the ground in a ball of fire. 6 men gone in an instant. And then the fighters came back. 10 of them this time. The survivors of the earlier attacks reinforced by fresh aircraft from the Luftwaffe base. They dove through their own flak, ignoring the risk of friendly fire, desperate to stop the American bombers before they reached the bridge. "Target in sight," Tony Benedetto called from the nose. 2 minutes to drop. 2 minutes. An eternity in combat. Eddie held Ruth steady as the fighters closed in. His jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He could see the bridge now. A steel span across a canal, crawling with German work parties who were scrambling for cover. He could see the flak guns on either side, their barrels swinging to track the incoming bombers. He could see the fighters coming in from every direction, their guns winking with muzzle flashes. Willie Jackson's top turret was firing continuously, the twin .50s hammering at fighters that seemed to be everywhere at once. James Chen was firing from the waist position, his single gun tracking targets that flashed past too fast to aim properly. Bobby Patterson was screaming something incoherent from the tail, his guns blazing at a fighter that was trying to line up on Ruth's vulnerable backside. A 109 came in from the starboard side, so close that Eddie could see the pilot's face through his canopy. The Germans' 20mm cannon rounds walked across Ruth's wing, punching holes in the fuel tank, shattering the aileron, severing control cables that Eddie felt go slack in his hands. "Wing tanks hit," Morrison shouted. "We're leaking fuel." Eddie didn't respond. He was fighting the controls, trying to keep Ruth level with half her aileron cables gone. The aircraft wanted to roll to starboard, wanted to drop her right wing and spiral into the ground. Eddie held her straight through sheer force of will, his muscles screaming with the effort. 1 minute to drop. A fighter came in from dead ahead, guns blazing. Eddie saw the tracers coming, couldn't do anything about them, felt them punch through the nose of the aircraft. Tony Benedetto cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, and then went silent. "Tony!" Eddie shouted. "Tony! Report!" "He's hit," Morrison said, his voice flat. "Shoulder wound. I can see him. He's still conscious, still at the bomb site." "Tony, can you make the drop?" A long pause. Then, through gritted teeth, "I can make the drop." The bridge was directly ahead now, filling the windscreen. Eddie could see every detail, the rivets in the steel, the workers running for cover, the German soldier on the bridge deck who was firing his rifle at the incoming bombers. "Bombs away!" Ruth lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive fell from her belly. Eddie saw the bombs tumble toward the bridge, saw them strike the deck, saw the flash of detonation. And then he was past, banking hard to port, running for home with a wounded bombardier, a leaking fuel tank, damaged controls, and 10 German fighters on his tail. The fourth attack came 2 minutes after the bomb drop. The surviving fighters, 8 of them now, the formation's gunners having claimed 2 more, were furious. The bridge was damaged, possibly destroyed, and the bombers were escaping. They threw themselves at the fleeing Americans with desperate ferocity, ignoring their own losses, determined to extract a price for the attack. Eddie's formation had been reduced to 7 aircraft. 5 bombers had gone down over the target. 30 men dead or captured in less than 10 minutes. The survivors were scattered, their tight formation broken by the chaos of the attack. Each aircraft fighting its own private war against the swarming fighters. Ruth was in the worst shape of all. Her right wing was streaming fuel from the punctured tank, leaving a vapor trail that marked her position for every fighter in the sky. Her aileron controls were hanging by a thread, responding sluggishly to Eddie's inputs. Her number 2 engine was running rough, its oil pressure dropping steadily, and Tony Benedetto was slumped over his bomb site, conscious but fading, his shoulder wound seeping blood onto the cockpit floor. "Fighter, 6 o'clock high," Bobby Patterson called. "He's lining up." Eddie couldn't evade. With damaged controls and a wounded aircraft, any violent maneuver would tear Ruth apart. All he could do was hold steady and pray. Bobby's guns opened up, hammering at the incoming fighter. The German pilot held his course, his cannon rounds striking Ruth's tail section, shredding the rudder, punching holes in the fuselage. Eddie felt the aircraft yaw to the right as aerodynamic forces took over from the damaged control surfaces. "He's breaking off!" Bobby shouted. "I think I hit him!" But the damage was done. Ruth was flying crooked now, her nose pointed 10 degrees left of her actual course. Eddie had to hold constant right rudder just to keep her going straight, and even that wasn't enough to fully compensate. "How far to the coast?" he asked. Morrison checked the map. 12 miles. Maybe 15 minutes at this speed. 15 minutes. A lifetime. The fifth attack came 8 minutes later, with the English coast finally visible on the horizon. The German fighters had taken losses. 4 of their original 18 aircraft were down, and several others were damaged. But they weren't giving up. They'd followed the bombers all the way across the North Sea, waiting for Ruth to slow down, to fall behind, to become the easy target they knew she was. Eddie saw them forming up behind him, 6 fighters in a loose gaggle, conserving fuel, biding their time. They knew Ruth was wounded. They knew she couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't fight them off forever. All they had to do was wait for her gunners to run out of ammunition. "How much ammo we got?" Eddie asked. "Top turret's down to about 200 rounds, Willie reported. "Maybe 2 more passes worth." "Waist gun's almost dry," James added. 50 rounds, maybe less. "Tail's still good," Bobby said. 300 rounds. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The fighters began their final approach, spreading out to attack from multiple angles. Eddie watched them come, knowing there was nothing he could do. Ruth was too damaged to evade, too slow to run, too weak to fight. And then the Spitfires arrived. 8 RAF fighters scrambled from Manston to cover the returning bombers, dove out of the clouds like angels of deliverance. Their .303 machine guns and 20mm cannons tore into the German formation, scattering the attackers, driving them away from the wounded B-26. The Spitfires were beautiful, sleek, deadly, utterly at home in the sky. Eddie watched them work with something like awe, their pilots weaving through the German formation with an ease that spoke of years of experience. These were the men who'd won the Battle of Britain, who'd held the line when everything seemed lost. Now they were saving his crew. Eddie watched a 109 explode as 2 Spitfires caught it in a crossfire. He watched a 190 dive for the deck, trailing smoke, its pilot trying to escape the sudden ambush. He watched the German formation dissolve, the surviving fighters breaking off and running for home. One of the Spitfire pilots pulled alongside Ruth, close enough that Eddie could see his face through the canopy. The RAF pilot gave a thumbs up, then peeled away to rejoin his formation. "Escorts here," Morrison said, and his voice was shaking. "Jesus Christ, Eddie, they made it." Eddie didn't respond. He was too tired, too drained, too focused on keeping Ruth in the air for just a few more minutes. The English coast was ahead of them, green and beautiful, and all he had to do was get there. Just a few more minutes. Ruth crossed the coast at 3:42 p.m. Nearly 9 hours after takeoff, her fuel tanks nearly empty, her controls barely responding. The white cliffs of Dover passed beneath them, and Eddie felt something loosen in his chest. They were home. Whatever happened next, they'd made it back to England. His crew would survive, even if Ruth didn't. But he wasn't ready to give up on his aircraft yet. Eddie called ahead to Bury St. Edmunds, warning them of his condition. No hydraulics meant no brakes. Damaged ailerons meant limited roll control. Damaged rudder meant he'd be coming in crooked, unable to fully align with the runway. The tower controller's voice was calm and professional, betraying none of the concern he must have felt. "Roger, Ruthless Ruth. Emergency equipment standing by. Wind is 270 at 12 knots. You're cleared for runway 27, straight in approach. Good luck." "We're going to need every inch of that runway," Eddie told Morrison, "and probably some of the grass beyond it." "At least we're going to need a runway," Morrison replied. "Better than the alternative." The approach was a nightmare. Eddie had to fly faster than normal to maintain control with his damaged surfaces, 160 miles per hour instead of the usual 130. He had to crab into the wind to compensate for his stuck rudder, approaching the runway at an angle that looked wrong to everyone watching from the ground. He had to time his flare perfectly, bleeding off speed at the last possible moment, touching down with just enough energy to roll but not enough to cartwheel. He nailed it. Ruth touched down hard but level, her wheels grabbing the runway, her wounded frame groaning with the strain. Eddie stood on the useless brake pedals, knowing they wouldn't respond, feeling the aircraft accelerate as her engines continued to push her forward. "Kill the engines!" he shouted. Morrison pulled the mixture controls to idle cutoff. The engines coughed and died. Ruth began to slow, her wheels rolling free, her momentum carrying her down the runway toward the grass beyond. She stopped 50 feet past the end of the concrete, her nose wheel buried in the soft ground, her tail sticking up at an angle that would have been comical if it wasn't so close to disastrous. Eddie sat in the cockpit for a long moment, his hands still gripping the controls, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. He'd done it. He'd brought them home. All of them. Around Ruth, the emergency crews were already at work. Fire trucks stood ready, their crews watching the smoking engines for any sign of flame. An ambulance had pulled up to the nose, its medics waiting to treat the wounded. Ground crew were chalking the wheels, even though Ruth wasn't going anywhere under her own power. Morrison reached over and put a hand on Eddie's shoulder. "Hell of a job, Skipper." Eddie nodded slowly. He didn't trust his voice to work properly. Behind him, he could hear the crew climbing out through the rear hatch, James and Bobby dropping to the ground, Willie following more slowly. They were alive, all of them. After everything that had happened, after all the ways they should have died, they were alive. "Let's go see how bad it is," Eddie said finally, and unbuckled his harness. The damage was worse than he'd imagined. Walking around Ruth with Morrison, Eddie counted the holes in her aluminum skin. 37 in the fuselage, 23 in the wings, 41 in the tail section. The rudder looked like Swiss cheese, more whole than metal. The right aileron was hanging by a single hinge, flapping in the light breeze. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Harold Finch, had followed them around the aircraft, making notes on a clipboard. His face got grimmer with each new discovery. "Captain," Finch said finally, "I've been working on B-26s since they came off the production line. I've never seen one take this much damage and still fly. This bird should be at the bottom of the North Sea." "She's a good airplane," Eddie replied. "She just needed someone to believe in her." Finch shook his head. "With respect, sir, it's going to take more than belief to fix her. I'm not even sure we have enough spare parts." "Do what you can, Sergeant. I'd like to fly her again." Tony Benedetto was evacuated to the base hospital, where surgeons removed a 20mm cannon fragment from his shoulder. He would recover fully and return to flight status 3 months later, finishing the war with 32 missions and a Distinguished Flying Cross. The rest of Ruth's crew walked away from the aircraft without serious injury. Bruises, scratches, ringing ears, but nothing that wouldn't heal. They stood on the grass beside their battered bomber and stared at the damage. 137 bullet and cannon holes, a shredded rudder, a punctured fuel tank, 3 severed control cables, and an engine that was leaking oil from a cracked cylinder head. By any reasonable standard, Ruth should have been shot down. By any reasonable standard, her crew should have been killed, along with the crews of the other 7 B-26 that had gone down during the mission. By any reasonable standard, the attack on Ijmuiden should have been the disaster that everyone had predicted. But Eddie Kowalczyk had refused to cooperate with reasonable standards. Colonel Robert Williams, commanding officer of the 322nd Bombardment Group, was waiting when Eddie's crew reached the debriefing room. Williams had watched the mission from the control tower, listening to the radio chatter, counting the aircraft that didn't come back. He'd seen Ruth limp home, had watched her impossible landing, had already started composing the letters he'd have to write to the families of the 30 men who hadn't made it. Now, he was looking at the man who'd brought 6 men home through 5 fighter attacks, flak, and a target that should have killed them all. "Captain Kowalczyk," Williams said slowly, "that was the most remarkable piece of flying I've ever witnessed." "Thank you, sir." "Your aircraft was shot to pieces, your bombardier was wounded, your controls were damaged, and you still made the bomb run and brought your crew home." "We had a job to do, sir. We did it." Williams shook his head. "The bridge is down, by the way. Photo reconnaissance confirms the center span collapsed. Your bombs did that." Eddie nodded. He was too tired to feel satisfaction, too drained to feel anything except a desperate need to sleep. "The Silver Star," Williams said. "I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. Your entire crew, for that matter. What you did today, it's going to be remembered." The mission to Ijmuiden became a legend in the 322nd Bombardment Group. It also became a lesson. The losses, 8 aircraft out of 12, a casualty rate of 67%, forced the Army Air Forces to reconsider its tactics. Low-level daylight attacks against heavily defended targets were simply too costly, no matter how skilled the pilots or how brave the crews. The B-26 groups shifted to medium-altitude bombing, trading precision for survivability, accepting the limitations of their aircraft rather than fighting against them. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, wrote in his assessment of the Ijmuiden raid, "The courage displayed by these crews was beyond question, but courage alone cannot overcome the laws of physics and probability. We must find tactics that give our men a reasonable chance of survival, not merely a heroic chance of sacrifice." The change in tactics wasn't immediate. The Army Air Force's bureaucracy moved slowly, even in wartime, but it was inevitable. Within 2 months, the B-26 groups had abandoned low-level attacks entirely. Within 6 months, they had developed new bombing techniques that reduced losses to acceptable levels. Within a year, the B-26 had transformed from a liability to an asset. The change saved lives, hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. The B-26 went from being the most dangerous aircraft in the American inventory to one of the safest, its loss rate dropping below that of any other bomber in the European theater. The Widowmaker became the dependable lady, and the crews who flew her learned to love her quirks instead of fearing them. Eddie Kowalczyk was part of that transformation. He'd proven that the B-26 could survive almost anything if flown by a skilled pilot. He'd also proven that survival wasn't enough, that tactics had to change, that commanders had to learn, that the lives of air crews had to be valued as much as the targets they were sent to destroy. Eddie Kowalczyk flew 47 more missions before the war ended. He never lost another aircraft, never had another crew member seriously wounded, never again faced the kind of desperate odds he'd faced over Ijmuiden. He was good, he was lucky, and he was smart enough to know the difference. After the war, he went home to Chicago and married Ruth, the real Ruth, the one who'd inspired the name of his aircraft. They had 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and a marriage that lasted 53 years. Eddie worked as a commercial pilot for United Airlines, flying passengers across the country in aircraft that were considerably more comfortable than a B-26. Ruth, his wife, not the airplane, often teased him about naming the bomber after her. "You named a plane that almost got you killed after me," she'd say. "What does that say about our relationship?" "It says you're tough," Eddie would reply. "It says you don't give up. It says you bring people home no matter what." He kept a model of a B-26 on his desk at United and later in his study at home. It was the only memento of the war he displayed openly. The medals were in a drawer somewhere. The photographs were in albums that rarely got opened, but the model sat where he could see it every day, a reminder of what he'd survived, what his crew had accomplished, what the Marauder had meant to him. Sometimes his grandchildren would ask about it, and Eddie would tell them stories, not the scary ones, not the ones about death and fear and survival, but the funny ones. The time Tony Benedetto got lost over England and navigated them to Scotland by mistake. The time Bobby Patterson shot at a flock of seagulls, thinking they were German fighters. The time Willie Jackson fell asleep in the top turret and didn't wake up until they landed. The war stories they wanted to hear, the fighter attacks, the close calls, the mission to Ijmuiden, he kept to himself. He didn't talk about the war much. When his children asked about his medals, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal with 7 clusters, he'd shrug and change the subject. "I just flew the plane," he'd say. "The crew did the hard work." But the crew remembered differently. Bobby Patterson, the tail gunner who'd shot down 2 German fighters over Ijmuiden, stayed in touch with his former pilot for decades. In a letter written in 1982, he tried to explain what Eddie had meant to them. "When the fighters came, we were all scared, every single one of us. We were 20-something years old, flying a plane that wanted to kill us, getting shot at by people who definitely wanted to kill us. We had every reason to panic, to give up, to accept that we weren't going to make it. But Eddie never panicked, never gave up, never accepted anything except getting us home. He flew that shot-up airplane like it was brand new, made decisions in split seconds that saved all our lives, and never once let us see him sweat. That's what leadership is. Not giving orders, not being brave, just refusing to quit when everyone else is ready to give up. Just flying the plane when everyone knows the plane can't fly anymore. He brought us home, all of us, and we never forgot it. Eddie Kowalczyk died in 1997 at the age of 82. His obituary mentioned his military service, his career with United, his family. It mentioned Ijmuiden, briefly, the famous mission where his aircraft was hit 137 times and he still brought his crew home. It didn't mention the 5 fighter attacks, the wounded bombardier, the fuel leak, the damaged controls, the impossible landing, but the men who were there remembered. At his funeral, Willie Jackson, the top turret gunner who'd run out of ammunition defending Ruth from the German fighters, stood up to speak. He was 81 years old, frail and gray, but his voice was steady as he looked at the flag-draped coffin of his former pilot. "They told us we were going to die," he said, "before the mission. They said 50% losses, maybe more. They said it was a suicide run. They said the only question was whether we'd die over the target or on the way home." Eddie didn't say anything. He just walked out to the plane, climbed in, and started the engines, and we followed him, all of us, because if Eddie thought we could make it, then maybe we could. And we did, because of him, because he refused to let us die. Willie Jackson saluted the coffin, a gesture that took visible effort from his aged body, but was executed with the precision of a man who'd served his country 60 years before. "Rest easy, Captain. The mission's over. You brought us home." The honor guard folded the flag. Taps played across the cemetery, and somewhere in the skies over Europe, the ghost of Ruthless Ruth flew on, scarred and battered, leaking fuel and trailing smoke, but still flying, still refusing to die, because her pilot wouldn't let her. That was the lesson of Ijmuiden. That was the lesson of Ruthless Ruth and the crew who flew her through 5 fighter attacks and brought everyone home. Sometimes the mission is impossible. Sometimes the odds are hopeless. Sometimes everything says you should give up, turn back, save yourself. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you fly the plane when the plane can't fly. Sometimes you bring your crew home when everyone says it can't be done. Sometimes you refuse to cooperate with the reasonable expectation that you should die. And sometimes that makes all the difference. If you want to see more stories like this, check out one of these videos here. We'll see you next time.